these afternoon sessions are announced as dealing with Gnosticism and Hermeticism within the context of the theme of our sessions at the present time. And so this evening, or rather this afternoon, I propose to make a stab at the possible ways in which we may observe and contemplate the origins and the overall character, the nature of the Gnostic and Hermetic traditions. When the national president asked me about a little less than a year ago, last November, whether I would undertake this task, I think one of the elements that we had in mind related to the topic of last night's talk that I gave, namely that there are certain ancestor traditions of the Theosophical philosophy and of the Theosophical movement, from which, by way of certain historical trajectories, they may be said to descend in a fairly direct line, and that these are primarily Neoplatonism, and by way of Neoplatonism, perhaps a kind of quintessential distillation of much of Greek philosophy in general, and that is, of course, the one that Tony Lisi is dealing with. And then the Hermetic and the Gnostic traditions in addition to that. And by the way, I should have asked that probably before, but I'll ask it now. How many of you were here at the talk last night? It's a pretty large minority, thank you. That, that will be good, because that will allow me to join what I have to say now to what we said at that time. And of course, last night's talk is available in certainly in audio format, so that those of you who wish can undoubtedly avail yourselves of that. So therefore, we don't need to repeat anything that was said last night. But what we need to keep in mind, nevertheless, is that by as far as the historical origins of a more remote nature of the modern theosophical tradition are concerned, we need to cast our glance to the period of history that at least at one time was usually referred to as late antiquity or the late ancient era, and more particularly the first sort of maybe 3.5 or 4 centuries of the common or Christian era, when in the Mediterranean region, more particularly centered in Hellenistic Egypt, a tremendous and perhaps unprecedented flowering of spirituality and really of culture in general took place. There are times like that in history when all of a sudden, for a period of time, there is a tremendous kind of energy of a particular character that appears to be available and that stimulates and energizes a people of a particular line of interest. And that is really what occurred in Egypt after it was conquered by the great Greek leader and ruler, Alexander the Great. And when Alexander and his successors, the successors of his generals who divided up the vast area that he conquered, in this case, the Ptolemies, the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt took over, and under their aegis there occurred a sort of truly marvelous conjunction, a marriage of the Greek spirit with its own particular spirituality, and of that spirit of incredible antiquity and profundity, and perhaps also many puzzling, mysterious qualities, the spirit of ancient Egypt. Incidentally, I hold with the great theosophical scholar Duncan Greenlees, who was mentioned in our Get Acquainted session, that there is no particular need to postulate mysterious and remote and unprovable origins for the culture and civilization of ancient Egypt, reaching back into mythic Atlantis or things of that sort. Duncan Greenlees, who was trained as an Egyptologist, felt, and he wrote that in his wonderful little book, the Gospel of the Pyramids, which you probably have in the library here. Just about all of his books are out of print now. In the Gospel of the Pyramids, in the introduction, he wrote that it is an insult to the people of Egypt to assume that their traditions, their spirituality had to come from somewhere else, and that one of the perhaps the chief distinguishing feature that sets ancient pharaonic Egypt apart from others is that it was of incredible antiquity. And so the Egyptian civilization, the Egyptian culture was one that grew from extremely primitive, probably kind of shamanistic beginnings, and moved from that to a truly complex high culture and spirituality. And so at that time, in the wake of the conquests of Alexander, the Greek spirit and the Egyptian spirit came together and created what appeared to have been just a marvelous spiritually fertile ground in the mind for certain approaches to often a very transcendental spiritual orientation. And it is therefore it is that cultural matrix, that milieu, and the traditions therein that we are concerned with. And of course, it is also that that spiritual matrix that H.P. Blavatsky and her associates in November 1875, when they founded the Theosophical Society, I think at the suggestion of a kind of imaginative offbeat scholar who was a friend of Blavatsky's, Professor Wilder, chose the name Theosophy and for the Theosophical Society, because they chose a name, as most of you are aware, that originated in Hellenistic, which just means Greekified Alexandria, by the early great mysterious Neoplatonist teacher Ammonius Saccas as a name for the wisdom that he promoted, the Theosophia, the divine wisdom, the wisdom of the gods. And he himself, of course, primarily because unlike some of his disciples later on, I'm infringing now on Tony Lissi's territory, unlike Plotinus and some of the other great Neoplatonists who came in his wake, Ammonius had very little formal education or schooling, and so he was referred to routinely by his admirers as ho theodidactos, the God-taught one, he who was taught by the gods rather than by humans. And so I am sure that this choice, which was enthusiastically endorsed by Blavatsky, carries a certain meaning. Blavatsky was highly interested in documenting her indebtedness and her connections with the Alexandrian spirituality by adopting the name Theosophy. Now, the fact that especially once the society's leadership moved for a period of time to India and established significant connections there, then let's say the kindred and at times perhaps almost analogous traditions of the East, such as Buddhism, and certain forms of Buddhism and certain forms of Hinduism came to be prominently included in the among the forebears of the Theosophical tradition. Yet that Alexandrian matrix of the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th century remained crucial and remains seminal. It's extremely important seeds there that carried through the entire Western spirituality, the Western esoteric tradition, and then came together in the late 19th century in the formulation of that tradition that came to be known as Theosophy. Now, what we need to keep in mind, and I'll hearken back to elements that undoubtedly you heard this morning from Tony Lisi, that in the ancient Mediterranean world, there existed an interesting and perhaps for us rather instructive spiritual pattern. If you look at Greece, which of course he particularly did, we look at Egypt, we look at Rome, we look at the Persian, Babylonian area also, maybe to a lesser extent there. In all of these places, we find, first of all, that there were well-established, very colorful and very dramatic state religions. The state religions were primarily organized around the cycle of the year. They had fabulous, dramatic holidays at different times of the year, when people would get together in great processions and great festivals, and very, very colorful and often really very joyous and very ecstatic. At other times perhaps a little more somber, depending on the tone of the season. And these events and activities served what might be called folk religiosity. And by that we mean that the majority of people, the folk, have generally in every culture, but speaking of those cultures particularly, have a particular approach to religion, to spirituality, which we might say sort of satisfies the basic spiritual and religious needs of the largest number of people. And what are those needs? Well, those needs are probably, if we are to sum them up critically and analytically, they exist in the area of human anxiety and helplessness. Now, you may feel, as so many people pretend nowadays, I don't know whether a lot of people actually feel that way, but they sure pretend a lot, maybe more in my dear California than here, to be empowered. Have you ever heard that? You know, everybody wants to be empowered. Everybody is empowered. And if you have an activity and you advertise it as empowerment, man, oh Manischewitz, you know, people will be coming there from everywhere. Everybody wants to be empowered. Now, this also, of course, is another manifestation of that same kind of need. You know, from the very beginning of the human race, when our remote ancestors were still out fighting saber-toothed tigers and, I don't know, dodging the gigantic feet of the dinosaurs and all of that, and sort of the old Jurassic Park syndrome, you know, people recognize that life is hazardous, hard, and difficult, and short, and anxiety-inducing. I don't think that we have lost that complex since then, because while the circumstances have altered, we still are. And so along came the various schools of, say, folk religiosity, and in various ways they conveyed to the people the conviction, and with the conviction the feeling, that contrary to a lot of apparent evidence, somehow, some way, underneath it all, things are still okay. Things are going to end well. And so we need not be anxious, and we need not succumb to despair, because there is some kind of an underlying pattern which is not that easily discerned. One has to really look for it, which moves toward the good. For instance, a good example of it is ancient Egypt, since we are speaking about that, where the religious orientation of the folk religiosity was largely patterned upon the cyclical relationship of our earth, let's say, to the sun, and where the daily cycle was regarded as the great paradigm of the way life and death function. That here is the day we see the glorious sun, our Lord Ra, in the sky, how he's sailing on his boat with the other gods, and at various times of the day, people in the morning, at noon, in the evening, and they, according to the positions of the sun, people would pray and salute the luminaries in the sky. And then what happens? Sun goes down and it's dark. Apparently the light has gone out, and that is a little bit terrifying. The night is always a little more terrifying than the day, because we don't see what might be sneaking up on us. And that's a very, very reasonable position. You know, there are all kinds of beings and critters and whatever you may call them, colloquially or otherwise, in this world, who are out to get you. And if you neglect that circumstance, or if that circumstance has escaped your notice until now, then maybe you ought to look again. In fact, you can't even see some of the most dangerous ones who are out to get you, who are microbes and viruses and all kinds of things like that. They are all there, they are trying to get inside of your body, and they are determined to kill you. Because that's how they live on your life. You know, John Algeo very wisely pointed out once when we were here with him in a conference that in this world life lives on life. And to which I add, and you better remember it and keep it in mind. It's not a pleasant thing to keep in mind, but if you take the right consequences, it may be useful. So that's why the dark is always dangerous. But, said the Egyptians, remember yesterday, remember the day before yesterday. What happened then? The sun went down, the gods disappeared, there was no more light. But a certain number of hours later, in the east, there it rose again, it came back. And that this is the grand metaphor of being, that nothing is lost. It looks as if it were lost, but it comes back. This is what Mircea Eliade of University of Chicago fame referred to, and he coined, I think, that term, the myth of the eternal return, that all things return. And with the ideas of this sort, which are very common to ancient folk religiosity, people, let's say, were reassured about a certain kind of meaning in life. That nothing is lost, all things go on, including yourself. In fact, reincarnation is a sort of sophisticated application of that principle. The great folk religions of the ancient world were largely of that order, serving the basic religious needs of people about security, continuity, the overcoming of anxiety, and defeating despair. Very laudable objectives in any time, any history. But there were always some people, a minority, sometimes a rather small minority, that we would seem in the ancient Mediterranean a sizable minority, for whom and to whom this kind of religiosity was insufficient. It was not enough. It was not enough for them to be reassured about a kind of underlying cyclical lawfulness of life, existence within the cosmos. And what do we mean by that? We mean that there are always some people in this world for whom this kind of very basic reassurance is not enough. They want something else. They want a more radical and more final breakthrough into the world of transcendence. They don't just want to live within the cyclic patterns of a continuing cosmos, but they want to get past the cosmic patterns into something that transcends all patterns, all of that which, for instance, in Buddhism, especially in Mahayana Buddhism, but really in all of Buddhism, is often referred to as the great wheel. The great wheel that moves and within which is encompassed everything that happens in the cosmos, birth and death, and rebirth in various realms, visible and invisible, and ultimately rebirth again over and over and over. There are always people there whose inner being, whose soul asks, is that all there is? Am I here just to endlessly ride on the wheel? Or is there something that may happen that I could do, that I could participate in it, that would get me off that wheel, so that I would now achieve a certain spiritual sovereignty and freedom aside from that wheel. And if you look at the representations of that, there are many. In Buddhist iconography, you usually have the wheel, and it's held in the talons and in the teeth of a big kind of Halloween-looking creature, which is Mahakala, great time. The time holds the wheel. And it goes around, and then there are all these divisions of the various states of existence within the wheel. But if you look off to the side, sort of floating on little beautiful lotus thrones of their own, are liberated Buddhas in their aura of flames with their halos on, looking very, very blissful, because they are not on the wheel any longer. They have gotten off the wheel. They have stopped the world and have gotten off. Now, Buddhism, of course, really specialized in that, even though it became a folk religion in many, many countries and many places. But certainly the people were there in the ancient Mediterranean who also desired that. And for a long time, particularly in Greece, but in other places as well, they came to organize certain activities which addressed themselves to this specific task, to a breakthrough to transcendence, to experiences of consciousness which would demonstrate to the individual that he or she can get off that wheel. And these were called the mysteries. I avoid the 19th century term mystery schools, because I am convinced that they were not schools. There was no schoolmarm there who was giving you instruction in the ABC of spirituality or whatever, but rather they were activities within which, when the individual participated in these activities, great radical experiences, transformations of consciousness would occur. Now again, I don't want to infringe on my colleagues' work here, but let's say that was the raison d'être, as the French call it, the reason for being of the mysteries in Greece, in Egypt, in Rome, in Assyria, Babylon, and so forth. And these ancient peoples were a lot more tolerant, really, than we are in our civilization, because they saw absolutely no difficulty in allowing these two main religious orientations or systems to coexist. The folk religiosity, which addresses itself to the lower spiritual needs, let's say, on the one hand, and the transformative mystery spirituality on the other. When people had enough of the folk religiosity, they could graduate to the other, and they go through the mystery system and have those experiences. Now, just one little example of what mysteries could do. It was generally believed and stated by some of the greatest minds in Greece and in Rome, for instance, that the Eleusinian mysteries would take away from everyone who went through the mystery system, the lesser and the greater mysteries, would take away completely and forever the fear of death. Now that is a big accomplishment, big accomplishment. And how did that happen? By belief, by giving them another belief system that Jesus is going to wait for them on the other side and take them by the hand and lead them into heaven, or any other way? No. They experienced something. What could they have experienced? Well, we can conjecture, but in this particular case, I think we can probably make a rather accurate guess by saying that they experienced, just for a little while, a state of consciousness that was outside of time, timelessness. And once you experience timelessness, then the events within time become relative. They are relativated or relativized, or whichever way we might call them. And that is the kind of thing of which St. Paul the Apostle probably wrote. O death, where is thy sting? O grave, where is thy victory? Okay? When you experience something that is so radically different from that, and you were there, you saw it, you felt it, it worked its way right into your being, then issues of death and issues of rebirth, for that matter, sort of lose their overwhelming imperative power. They may still there, but you know that there is something else. These experiences are now set off against that other greater experience. Now, as time went on and we come to the period that we are talking about, a little change occurred in this practice. Yes, the mysteries were still there, and if you read Apuleius, for instance, the Roman, the man who created the genre of the short novel, you know, and if you are very squeamish, then you better read a somewhat expurgated version of it, because it, shall we say, kind of racy. You know, Apuleius has a problem. He has been changed into an ass. You know, he's a donkey. Then now he spends the rest of his time trying to re-become a human again. But at the same time, people will do things in front of a donkey that they generally will not do in front of humans. And so he gets to see and to hear some really strange stuff. And it's not all asinine either. And then eventually he comes to the mystery in Egypt. And he eats of the roses of Isis. And then he changes back into a human. He's out by the seashore, and the donkey eats the roses. I know I used to have a donkey. I don't remember that one was particularly fond of roses, but you know. In any event, Hungarian donkeys are different from Greek donkeys, I'm sure. And then he changes back into a human. Mystery system. But by this later period, let's say, the mystery system somewhat opened up. And there were now schools, not even schools, let's say spiritual associations, which were no longer established by the state and so forth, but which did in their own way what the mysteries had done before. They were in large measure the inheritors of the work of the mysteries. And that is how we need to look at the work of the Gnostics, my friends, and the Neoplatonists, and the Hermeticists, and perhaps the Neo-Pythagoreans and other smaller groups that existed at that time.